Why would a soldier turn down a lighter rifle that carried more bullets 3 times in the middle of a jungle war? That's exactly what many Australian troops did in Vietnam. While American forces eagerly adopted the futuristic M16, the Aussies clung to something heavier, louder, and older, the British L1A1 SLR. It wasn't just about firepower, it was about philosophy, survival, and respect earned through war. And on one rain-soaked day in 1966, that decision would be tested like never before. August 18, 1966, the Long Tan rubber plantation in Phuoc Tuy Province, South Vietnam, was soaked in monsoon rain and filled with tension so thick it could snap like wire. Visibility was down to just a few meters. Trees and rubber trunks stood in eerie silence between bursts of machine gun fire and exploding mortars. In the heart of it all, Private Paul Large of Delta Company, 6th Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, crouched low, hands clenched tightly around the wooden grip of his L1A1 self-loading rifle. His knuckles were white, his jaw locked. The noise was deafening, the situation desperate. Delta Company, numbering just 108 Australian soldiers, was locked in a deadly battle with an estimated 2,000 North Vietnamese Army, NVA, and Viet Cong, VC troops. They were surrounded. Radio contact flickered. Artillery support was patchy at best. But in the chaos, Paul Large refused to let go of the weapon he trusted most. Not an M16, the sleek, lightweight rifle many American troops had already adopted, but the heavier, older British-designed L1A1 SLR, made from steel and wood, firing the powerful 7.62-meter NATO round. He had been offered the M16 3 times by grateful American soldiers. Lighter, faster, and with more rounds per magazine, but he always refused. And now, as enemy soldiers surged through the jungle like ghosts in the rain, that decision was about to be tested in blood. For 4 brutal hours, the Australians held their ground. They fought in near total visibility, often relying more on instinct than sight. Each shot fired had to count. The thick jungle vegetation devoured sound and light. Gun barrels steamed. Mud soaked through boots and into bones. But the L1A1 rifles kept firing, round after round, even as their operators grew exhausted and ammunition began to run out. When the battle finally ended, 18 Australians had been killed, but more than 200 enemy soldiers lay dead in the plantation. Survivors would later say that the weight, recoil, and noise of the L1A1 had saved their lives, that its stopping power had given them the edge when numbers, terrain, and weather had turned against them. What happened that day at Long Tan became legend in the Australian military, not just for the courage displayed, but for what it revealed about the Australian approach to war. Their equipment choices weren't based on trends or shiny new models. They were based on hard-earned lessons from years of fighting in similar terrain, in places like Malaya and Borneo, against similar enemies, in similarly unforgiving jungles. The L1A1 wasn't just a weapon, it was a philosophy. And while many around them praised the benefits of rapid-fire suppression and lighter gear, the Australians believed in something else: precision, reliability, and power. When your life might depend on a single shot cutting through thick vegetation and dropping an enemy instantly, there was no substitute. The Battle of Long Tan proved that philosophy in the most unforgiving way possible. The Battle of Long Tan had ended, but the questions it raised lingered among soldiers and commanders alike. Why had the Australians, despite being outnumbered nearly 20-1, held their ground so effectively? And why did they cling to their heavy, old-school L1A1 rifles when the Americans, technologically superior and logistically vast, were embracing the lighter, futuristic M16? The answer, as many veterans would later explain, had nothing to do with nostalgia and everything to do with mindset. When Australian forces entered Vietnam in 1962, they brought more than just their rifles. They brought experience, hard-earned knowledge from years of fighting communist insurgents in the jungles of Malaya and Borneo. They knew what it meant to fight in terrain where visibility was measured in meters, not kilometers, where every sound echoed through dripping vines and dense undergrowth, where you might only get one shot before the enemy disappeared into the foliage again. This experience shaped not just their tactics, but their entire approach to combat. Unlike the American doctrine of fire superiority, built around suppression, volume, and maneuver, the Australian doctrine emphasized patience, stealth, and precision. Their troops didn't spray bullets in the hope of hitting something. They waited. They observed. And when the time came, they made their shots count. Warrant Officer Kevin Dasher Wheatley of the Australian SAS, who would later be posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, once summed it up to an American advisor during a joint operation in 1965. His words became legend among both forces. Your blokes fire 1,000 rounds and hit 20 targets. Our blokes fire 20 rounds and hit 20 targets. Different approaches, mate. That wasn't arrogance, it was philosophy. A belief in quality over quantity. And that belief demanded a different kind of weapon. One that didn't just fire fast, but hit hard. One that could penetrate thick bamboo or jungle brush and still drop an enemy with a single shot. One that could be trusted not to jam in mud, rain, or heat. The L1A1 self-loading rifle, chambered in 7.62mm NATO, was the physical embodiment of that belief. Its recoil was heavier. It only fired semi-automatically. It carried fewer rounds. But in return, it delivered sheer stopping power, durability, and mechanical simplicity that soldiers could rely on. In contrast, the American M16, lightweight, accurate, and capable of fully automatic fire, suited a different kind of warfare, one where squads laid down suppressive fire while maneuvering, one where quantity often trumped precision. On paper, the 5.5-inch M16 made perfect sense, but war isn't fought on paper. Australian soldiers saw this contrast unfold firsthand. They trained alongside American units, watched them move through the jungle with black face paint and slick rifles, and respected their aggression and firepower. But deep down, many of them believed that the M16's advantages didn't match the brutal demands of Vietnam's triple canopy chaos. Their weapon of choice was heavier, louder, and slower, but it fit their doctrine like a glove. In every ambush, every patrol, and every brush with death, the L1A1 wasn't just a tool, it was a reflection of the soldier behind it. By the mid-1960s, the two primary rifles in Vietnam, the Australian L1A1 and the American M16, represented not only different doctrines, but vastly different engineering philosophies. To understand why Australian soldiers clung to their L1A1s even when offered sleeker alternatives, we must go beyond battlefield stories and into the gritty mechanics of war. At first glance, the numbers seem close. The L1A1 weighed around 9.5 pounds, 4.3 kilograms fully loaded, while the M16 came in at a featherlight 7.6 pounds, 3.4 kilograms. The M16 fired a 5.56mm round with an effective range of 550 meters. The L1A1, chambered in 7.62mm NATO, was rated up to 600 meters. Both rifles used 20-round magazines. On paper, it looked like a toss-up. But no soldier fights on paper. In the thick, humid, and mud-choked jungles of Vietnam, how a weapon functioned was more important than its stats. The L1A1 featured a gas piston operating system. Simple, reliable, and easy to maintain. Gas from a fired round pushed a piston, which drove the bolt carrier backward, cycling the next round. This design was proven in countless environments and resistant to dirt, sand, and carbon buildup. The M16, however, operated on a direct impingement gas system. Instead of a piston, it funneled hot gases directly into the receiver to cycle the bolt. In theory, this simplified the design and reduced weight. In practice, it led to fouling, overheating, and catastrophic failures, especially early in the war. Worse still, the U.S. military had switched the rifle's propellant powder from the original clean-burning MR powder to a cheaper, standard ball powder. This change increased the cyclic rate of fire and drastically worsened fouling in the gas tube. The result? M16s jammed in firefights. Some soldiers died with cleaning rods still lodged in the barrel, desperately trying to clear blockages under fire. The Australian troops watched these developments with growing unease. While they respected the innovation behind the M16, they quietly thanked their own procurement officers for sticking with the L1A1. In the worst jungle conditions, monsoons, waist-deep mud, rotting vegetation, the L1A1 continued to function. Sometimes dirty, sometimes worn, but always firing. There were trade-offs. The L1A1 kicked hard. Recoil management was essential. It was long and unwieldy in tight terrain, but Australian soldiers adapted. They fired from braced positions. They carried their rifles muzzle down in the rain. They maintained discipline. They didn't need full auto fire to suppress the enemy. They only needed one accurate shot. And when that shot was fired, the 7.62 millimeter round told its own story. It punched through bamboo thickets, shattered tree limbs, and dropped enemies behind cover. It was a round built for stopping, not just hitting. The jungle didn't care about theory. It rewarded reliability, simplicity, and raw power. And in those terms, the L1A1 delivered exactly what Australian soldiers demanded from their rifles: survival. While the standard L1A1 served regular Australian infantry well, it was among the elite operators of the Australian Special Air Service Regiment, SASR, that the rifle took on a new life, one forged not by doctrine, but by sheer necessity. The SAS were ghosts in the jungle. Operating deep behind enemy lines for weeks at a time, they conducted reconnaissance, ambushes, and hit-and-run strikes with surgical precision. Their missions required silence, discipline, and overwhelming violence when the time came to strike. But the standard L1A1, though powerful, was long and unwieldy for close-quarters ambushes. Something needed to change. So the SAS created the bitch. It wasn't an official designation. It wasn't in any manual. It was a name whispered between patrols, half joking, half reverent, for a weapon born of pure combat pragmatism. The process was brutal but effective. Starting with a standard L1A1 or the heavier L2A1 automatic rifle variant, SAS armorers would saw off the barrel just past the gas block, reducing the overall length dramatically. The bipod, if present, was removed. Some versions were fitted with custom flash suppressors to help with muzzle control. Others had their trigger groups modified for full automatic fire, something not standard on the semi-auto-only L1A1. What emerged was not a rifle, but a howling, muzzle-blasting monster. Short, loud, and brutally powerful. It was too unbalanced for precise shooting, too loud for stealth, but for ambushes, it was perfect. When the SAS initiated contact, they wanted the enemy to freeze, hesitate, and run. And the bitch delivered just that. The muzzle flash lit up the jungle like a camera strobe. The blast cracked like thunder, echoing through the trees. And the sheer weight of the 7.62 millimeter automatic fire gave the impression of an entire platoon opening up, when it was often just 3 or 4 men. One unnamed SAS veteran, speaking years later, recounted a nighttime ambush in 1968. We hit a VC logistics column at night, 5 of us, maybe 20 of them. We opened up with the modified SLRs, and it sounded like World War II erupted in that jungle. The flash lit up everything. The noise was deafening. Half of them dropped instantly. The other half ran. It was over in less than a minute. This was the genius of the bitch. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a psychological bomb. It exploited fear and confusion, buying the seconds they needed to dominate and vanish. American Special Operations units soon took notice. Navy SEALs, LRRP teams, and MACV SOG operators began requesting joint patrols with SAS units, not just to fight, but to learn. They saw in the Australians a different kind of warfighter, disciplined, inventive, and utterly lethal. In a war often defined by technology and bureaucracy, the bitch stood as a raw reminder that sometimes the best weapon is the one you build yourself, with a hacksaw, a wrench, and a desperate need to survive. The jungle doesn't play favorites. Whether you wore a slouch hat or a boonie hat, whether your rifle was British steel or American polymer, survival in Vietnam demanded adaptation, and no one adapted faster than the Special Forces. After encountering the Australian SAS and witnessing their unorthodox methods, many American Special Operations units realized they had something to learn. Australian SAS patrols were different. They moved quieter, stayed out longer, and struck harder. Their philosophy was grounded in a kind of tactical purity. Every move had purpose, every piece of gear was earned, not issued. For American SEALs, LRRP, long-range reconnaissance patrol teams, and MACV SOG operators, this was refreshing and compelling. Word spread quickly in the shadows. SEAL teams operating in the Mekong Delta began requesting cross-training with SAS patrols. Not just to observe, but to absorb. They studied the way Australians organized ambushes, how they tracked signs in the bush, how they packed light, moved slow, and killed quickly. Most importantly, they noticed the rifles. American Special Forces were already growing skeptical of the M16's reliability. While improvements had been made since its disastrous early deployment, many still found it lacking under the harshest conditions. When they saw what the SAS were carrying, L1A1s modified into compact beasts, or the bitch ripping through jungle with deafening authority, they wanted in. Some American units operating alongside Australians managed to procure L1A1s for themselves, especially for specific missions where stopping power and intimidation were more important than rate of fire or ammunition count. In close quarters ambushes, particularly at night, the psychological impact of the modified rifles was undeniable. But the influence wasn't just one way. The Australians, ever pragmatic, weren't blind to the advantages of American gear. On certain long-range reconnaissance missions, where every ounce mattered, some SAS patrol members chose to carry M16s for their lighter weight, especially radio operators, medics, or scouts who had to carry additional gear. The 5.56mm round might not drop a target through heavy cover, but it was easier to carry twice as much ammo, and the compact design helped in dense terrain. There were even hybrid setups. Some SAS troopers mounted American M203 grenade launchers beneath their L1A1s, combining the raw power of the 7.62mm round with the devastating utility of a 40mm explosive. These personalized loadouts reflected a broader truth. The best warriors aren't loyal to gear, they're loyal to effectiveness. This cross-pollination of tactics and weapons created a rare synergy between the two nations' elite forces. It wasn't about national pride or proving superiority. It was about what worked. The Australians brought patience, precision, and jungle-hardened instincts. The Americans brought aggressive initiative, cutting-edge equipment, and an ability to mobilize on a massive scale. Together, they forged a kind of tactical brotherhood that left its mark on special operations doctrine for decades to come. It wasn't uncommon for American LRRPs to return from a joint patrol and petition their commanders for more time with SAS teams, not because the Australians had better gear, but because they had honed their craft through quiet discipline and practical experience. Their rifles were just an extension of that ethos. In the mud and sweat of Vietnam, respect wasn't given. It was earned, and the Australian SAS earned it not with words, but with dead silence before the ambush and thunder after. Despite the respect and near reverence Australian soldiers held for the L1A1, the choice of weapon in Vietnam wasn't always ideological. On the front lines, function dictated form, and form followed the mission. While most infantrymen clung to the dependable steel and wood of the SLR, a growing number of soldiers, especially in support or reconnaissance roles, quietly embraced the American M16. Not every soldier was tasked with kicking in the front door of an ambush. Some carried radios the size of a suitcase. Others hauled medical kits, mapping equipment, or additional batteries for communication relays. For these men, every kilogram mattered. A full loadout of extra gear, paired with a heavy L1A1 and 7 or 8 steel magazines of 7.62mm rounds, could quickly become a physical liability, especially when patrolling through triple canopy jungle in 35-degree heat. The M16, weighing nearly 2 pounds less and using significantly lighter ammunition, offered immediate relief. A soldier could carry twice the amount of ammo for the same weight. For radio operators, medics, forward observers, and some officers, this wasn't just convenience, it was survival. Corporal Dennis Spanner Briggs, a radio operator with 7 RAR in 1969, famously defended his decision to carry an M16 when criticized by an old-school rifleman. "You carry 30 pounds of radio gear and a full SLR load, then tell me which you'd rather hump uphill for 6 hours. I'll take the plastic pea shooter, mate, and I'll still make mincemeat out of targets at 200 meters. No problem." There were trade-offs, of course. The M16 lacked the bone-breaking stopping power of the L1A1. In thick jungle, its smaller 5.56mm rounds could be deflected by dense foliage or fail to drop a charging enemy immediately. But for some soldiers, those risks were outweighed by the ability to move faster, travel lighter, and engage more flexibly. Moreover, as the war progressed and the M16's early design flaws were corrected, with the return to proper ammunition, chrome-lined barrels, and better training on maintenance, The weapon's reliability improved dramatically. It was no longer the liability it had been in 1965. For many newer recruits, especially those rotating into country later in the conflict, the M16 didn't carry the same stigma it once had. Even within elite units like the SAS, some troopers began carrying M16s for long-range reconnaissance missions where mobility and silence were paramount. In operations requiring stealth and minimal engagement, the lighter rifle allowed for better endurance, faster movement, and less strain under heavy loads. This flexibility spoke to a broader truth in the Australian approach to war. No tool was sacred, only useful. The myth of every Aussie clutching an L1A1 to the grave was just that, a myth. In reality, Australian soldiers, especially those with combat experience, were pragmatists. They picked the right weapon for the right job. For some, that meant sticking with the tried-and-true L1A1. For others, it meant adapting, and yes, even appreciating, the M16 for what it could offer in the right hands and under the right conditions. Because in Vietnam, no one cared what you were carrying when the shooting started. They only cared that you could stay alive and return fire. In the unforgiving jungles of Vietnam, weapons did more than just fire bullets. They shaped behavior, tactics, and mindset. Nowhere was this more evident than in how the L1A1 self-loading rifle influenced the way Australian soldiers fought, trained, and thought. It was more than a tool, it was a teacher. Unlike the M16 with its option for fully automatic fire, the L1A1 was strictly semi-automatic only. There was no selector switch for full auto, no panic spray mode when things got hairy. If you wanted to hit your target, you had to aim. You had to control your breathing, time your shots, and let muscle memory take over. In a firefight, you didn't rely on volume. You relied on accuracy under pressure. This inherent limitation, if one could even call it that, enforced a kind of psychological discipline among Australian troops. From the first days of training, soldiers were drilled to make every shot count, to take cover, to observe, and to conserve ammunition. Jungle warfare, after all, was a game of inches and seconds. A wasted magazine could mean death. Private Jeff Monroe, a rifleman with 5 RAR, once said, "The SLR didn't let you be lazy. You couldn't just hold the trigger and pray. You had to watch, wait, and then drop the bastard with one shot. It made us better shooters, because it had to." This discipline echoed through every level of Australian jungle warfare doctrine. Patrol formations were tighter. Fire lanes were controlled. Soldiers knew the limits of their firepower and adjusted their ambush tactics accordingly. In many cases, the first burst from an Australian patrol would be just 2 or 3 shots, deliberate, lethal, and utterly silent afterward. It was psychological warfare in miniature, precision over panic. Even the physical characteristics of the L1A1 reinforced this approach. Its heavier weight and recoil punished sloppy handling. Its long length required forethought in tight terrain. Soldiers learned to move with it, to understand its rhythm, to trust its mechanical reliability under the worst conditions. And when they pulled the trigger, the 7.62mm NATO round delivered uncompromising results, punching through brush, cover, and flesh with devastating force. This had tactical ripple effects. Australian units were often assigned areas of operation known for heavy enemy presence. Yet they rarely engaged in spray-and-pray tactics or brute force assaults. Instead, they used methodical patrolling, long static observation, and sudden, overwhelming ambushes where each man might only fire a handful of rounds. This wasn't due to lack of aggression, but due to supreme confidence in their firepower and control. Interestingly, this approach often confused enemy forces. Captured Viet Cong prisoners reported believing they were attacked by much larger units due to the devastating accuracy and impact of fire, even though the actual number of Australian soldiers was small. One NVA after-action report even warned about Australian soldiers with heavy rifles who do not waste bullets. The rifle, in effect, became a filter for tactical excellence. It elevated marksmanship, honed self-control, and rewarded soldiers who thought before they shot. In a war often characterized by chaos and overkill, the L1A1 demanded clarity and focus. That's why, even after years of technological innovation, veterans who carried the SLR into battle still speak of it with reverence. Not just because it worked, but because it made them better at what they did: survive, fight, and win. By the time Australian combat forces withdrew from Vietnam in 1971, the L1A1 had become more than just standard issue. It had become legend. Through countless engagements, patrols, and ambushes, it had proven itself in every conceivable environment the war could throw at it. Monsoon storms, deep mud, thick bamboo, dry hills, and claustrophobic tunnels. Over 50,000 Australian troops had carried the L1A1 into combat during their rotations in Vietnam. Some wielded it in major battles like Long Tan and Coral Balmoral. Others took it deep into the jungle for months at a time with SAS patrols. It fired millions of rounds during the conflict, and its reputation only grew stronger as the war dragged on. And it wasn't just the Australians who took notice. Captured Viet Cong and NVA documents specifically referenced the L1A1 and the soldiers who carried them. They referred to heavy rifles with high stopping power, differentiating Australian troops from American units. Some reports advised avoiding direct ambushes on Australian patrols unless numerical superiority was overwhelming, noting the discipline and lethality of these enemy with heavy weapons. The psychological impact of the L1A1 was real. For enemy troops accustomed to facing lighter 5.56mm fire, the thunderous crack of a 7.62mm round and the damage it inflicted was demoralizing. One VC prisoner of war, interrogated in 1970, reportedly said, "When the Australians open fire, you die before you can run." Among Australian veterans, the respect for the L1A1 remained nearly universal. It was heavy. It kicked hard. It wasn't ideal for crawling through vines or swinging quickly around tight corners. But when it came to power, reliability, and sheer battlefield performance, nothing else came close. Some infantrymen would later joke that the L1A1 wasn't a rifle. It was a portable artillery piece. It could drop a man through a tree. It could shatter confidence with a single well-placed shot. It could be beaten, soaked, scratched, and ignored for days, and still fire when it mattered most. Even decades later, when the L1A1 was eventually replaced by the Austrian-designed Steyr AUG in 1988, many soldiers continued to speak of it with a kind of reverence normally reserved for comrades, not equipment. For them, the L1A1 wasn't just a tool, it was a companion, forged in war and proven in survival. Its weight trained their strength, its recoil trained their control, its limitations trained their discipline. And in return, it delivered one thing in abundance: trust.